Martians were all there. Now he was cut off, unarmed and alone save for what feeble help the desert life could give. Unless he could double back to the place somehow. But meanwhile he had to survive. He sat in a cave, looking down past a tortured wilderness of sand and bush and wind-carved rock, miles in the thin, clear air to the glitter of metal where the rocket lay. The man was a tiny speck in the huge barren landscape, a lonely insect crawling under the deep blue sky. Even by day the stars glistened in the tenuous atmosphere. Weak, pallid sunlight spilled over rocks tawny and ochreous and rust red, over the low dusty thorn bushes and the gnarled little trees and the sand that blew faintly between them. Equatorial Mars. Lonely or not, the man had a gun that could spang death clear to the horizon, and he had his beasts, and there would be a radio in the rocket boat for calling his fellows. And the glowing death ringed them in a charmed circle which Kreega could not cross without bringing a worse death on himself than the rifle would give. Or was there a worse death than that? To be shot by a monster and have his stuffed hide carried back as a trophy for fools to gape at. The old iron pride of his race rose in Kreega, hard and bitter and unrelenting. He didn't ask much of life these days. Solitude in his tower to think the long thoughts of a Martian and create the small exquisite artworks which he loved. The company of his kind at the gathering season, grave ancient ceremony and acrid merriment, and the chance to beget and rear sons. An occasional trip to the Earthling settling for the metal goods and the wine which were the only valuable things they had brought to Mars. A vague dream of raising his folk to a place where they could stand as equals before all the universe. No more. And now they would take even this from him. He rasped a curse on the human and resumed his patient work, chipping a spearhead for what puny help it could give him. The brush rustled dryly in alarm. Tiny hidden animals squeaked their terror. The desert shouted to him of the monster that strode toward his cave. But he didn't have to flee right away. Riordan sprayed the heavy metal isotope in a 10-mile circle around the old tower. He did that by night, just in case patrol craft might be snooping around. But once he had landed, he was safe. He could always claim to be peacefully exploring, hunting leapers or some such thing. The radioactive had a half-life of about 4 days, which meant that it would be unsafe to approach for some 3 weeks. 2 at the minimum. That was time enough, when the Martian was boxed in so small an area. There was no danger that he would try to cross it. The owlies had learned what radioactivity meant back when they fought the humans, and their vision, extending well into the ultraviolet, made it directly visible to them through its fluorescence. To say nothing of the wholly unhuman extra senses they had. No, Kreega would try to hide, and perhaps to fight, and eventually he'd be cornered. Still, there was no use taking chances. Riordan set a timer on the boat's radio. If he didn't come back within 2 weeks to turn it off, it would emit a signal which Wisby would hear, and he'd be rescued. He checked his other equipment. He had an air suit designed for Martian conditions, with a small pump operated by a power beam from the boat to compress the atmosphere sufficiently for him to breathe it. The same unit recovered enough water from his breath so that the weight of supplies for several days was, in Martian gravity, not too great for him to bear. He had a .45 rifle, built to shoot in Martian air, that was heavy enough for his purpose. And, of course, compass and binoculars and sleeping bag. Pretty light equipment, but he preferred a minimum anyway. For ultimate emergencies, there was the little tank of suspensine. By turning a valve, he could release it into his air system. The gas didn't exactly induce suspended animation, but it paralyzed efferent nerves and slowed the overall metabolism to a point where a man could live for weeks on 1 lungful of air. It was useful in surgery, and had saved the life of more than one interplanetary explorer whose oxygen system went awry. But Riordan didn't expect to have to use it. He certainly hoped he wouldn't. It would be tedious to lie fully conscious for days waiting for the automatic signal to call Wisby. He stepped out of the boat and locked it. No danger that an owlie would break in if he should double back. It would take tordenite to crack that hull. He whistled to his animals. They were native beasts, long ago domesticated by the Martians and later by man. The rockhound was like a gaunt wolf, but huge-breasted and feathered, a tracker as good as any terrestrial bloodhound. The hawk had less resemblance to its counterpart of Earth. It was a bird of prey, but in the tenuous atmosphere it needed a 6-foot wingspread to lift its small body. Riordan was pleased with their training. The hound bayed, a low, quavering note which would have been muffled almost to inaudibility by the thin air and the man's plastic helmet had the suit not included microphones and amplifiers. It circled, sniffing, while the hawk rose into the alien sky. Riordan did not look closely at the tower. It was a crumbling stump atop a rusty hill, unhuman and grotesque. Once, perhaps 10,000 years ago, the Martians had a civilization of sorts, cities and agriculture and a Neolithic technology. But according to their own traditions, they had achieved a union or symbiosis with the wildlife of the planet and had abandoned such mechanical aids as unnecessary. Riordan snorted. The hound bayed again. The noise seemed to hang eerily in the still, cold air, to shiver from cliff and crag and die reluctantly under the enormous silence. But it was a bugle call, a haughty challenge to a world grown old. Stand aside, make way. Here comes the conqueror. The animal suddenly loped forward. He had a scent. Riordan swung into a long, easy, low-gravity stride. His eyes gleamed like green ice. The hunt was begun. Breath sobbed in Kreega's lungs, hard and quick and raw. His legs felt weak and heavy, and the thudding of his heart seemed to shake his whole body. Still he ran, while the frightful clamor rose behind him and the padding of feet grew ever nearer. Leaping, twisting, bounding from crag to crag, sliding down shaly ravines and slipping through clumps of trees, Kreega fled. The hound was behind him and the hawk soaring overhead. In a day and a night they had driven him to this, running like a crazed leaper with death baying at his heels. He had not imagined a human could move so fast or with such endurance. The desert fought for him. The plants, with their queer, blind life that no Earthling would ever understand, were on his side. Their thorny branches twisted away as he darted through, and then came back to rake the flanks of the hound, slow him. But they could not stop his brutal rush. He ripped past their strengthless, clutching fingers and yammered on the trail of the Martian. The human was toiling a good mile behind, but showed no sign of tiring. Still Kreega ran. He had to reach the cliff edge before the hunter saw him through the rifle sights. Had to. And the hound was snarling a yard behind now. Up the long slope he went. The hawk fluttered, striking at him, seeking to lay beak and talons in his head. He battered at the creature with his spear and dodged around a tree. The tree snaked out a branch from which the hound rebounded, yelling till the rocks rang. The Martian burst onto the edge of the cliff. It fell sheer to the canyon floor, 500 feet of iron-streaked rock tumbling into windy depths. Beyond, the lowering sun glared in his eyes. He paused only an instant, etched black against the sky, a perfect shot if the human should come into view, and then he sprang over the edge. He had hoped the rockhound would go shooting past, but the animal braked itself barely in time. Kreega went down the cliff face, clawing into every tiny crevice, shuddering as the age-worn rock crumbled under his fingers. The hawk swept close, hacking at him and screaming for its master. He could not fight it, not with every finger and toe needed to hang against the shattering death. But he slid along the face of the precipice into a gray-green clump of vines, and his nerves thrilled forth the appeal of the ancient symbiosis. The hawk swooped again